After my father's death, my mother immediately said that she was finally marrying a worthy man and kicked me out of the home. After what my grandfather told me, the last time I saw my father, he was pale and gaunt, a shadow of the man I'd known. Cancer had stolen his vitality, but I'd been there every day, doing what I could to make him comfortable. He had been my hero, the steady anchor in our family, the one who could always be counted on. Losing him felt like losing a part of myself, and the days that followed the funeral were a blur of grief and disbelief. I couldn't imagine life without him. But just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my mother, Laura, shattered any illusion of stability I had left. It was only a week after the funeral when she called me into the living room, her face set with a strange expression, one I couldn't quite read. I'd assumed she wanted to talk about our plans, maybe go through some of Dad's things, but instead, she introduced me to a man named Mark. "Ethan, this is Mark," she said, her voice tight with an edge of defiance. We're engaged." The words hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. Engaged? I stared at her, then at Mark, who stood there with a smug look plastered across his face. He wore an expensive suit, his watch gleaming under the dim lights, and something about him made my skin crawl. How could she be engaged already? My father had been gone for a matter of days, and here she was, parading this stranger into our home. Engaged? I finally managed to choke out. "You're getting married?" "Yes, Ethan," she replied, as if I were being unreasonable. "We've been together for 6 months. I didn't want to tell you while your father was still alive. I didn't think you'd understand." She was right. I didn't understand. I didn't understand how she could have been seeing someone else while my father was dying. I didn't understand how she could stand there so casually, talking about marriage as if Dad's body wasn't barely cold in the ground. "And what? You just moved on?" I could barely keep the anger from my voice, the betrayal cutting deeper than I could have imagined. While he was suffering, you were off with this guy." Mark cleared his throat, stepping forward as if to take control of the situation. "Listen, Ethan," he began, his tone patronizing. "Your mother and I are in love. Sometimes, things happen that are beyond our control. We didn't mean for it to go this way, but here we are." I could feel my fists clenching, every fiber of my being screaming at me to tell him off, to tell them both off. But before I could say anything, my mother's next words hit me like a slap in the face. "Ethan, I need you to leave," she said, her tone flat and unyielding. "Mark and we want to start fresh. You're a reminder of the past, of my life with Robert. I can't have that hanging over us." I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. "You're kicking me out?" My voice cracked, the hurt and disbelief spilling over. "You're really kicking me out of my own home?" "It's not like that, Ethan," she said, a hint of exasperation in her voice. "I've already given you some money. There's $1,000 in your account. You'll have enough to get started somewhere else. You're young, you'll be fine." I wanted to scream, to tell her that money was the last thing I cared about, that I couldn't believe she was choosing this stranger over her own son. But no words came. I stood there, numb, watching as she folded her arms, as if daring me to challenge her decision. "Fine," I finally said, my voice hollow. "If you want me gone, I'll go. But don't expect me to come crawling back when this doesn't work out." She didn't respond, and I felt the last shreds of our bond disintegrate in that moment. She'd made her choice, and it wasn't me. Packing my things was surreal. I moved through the house in a daze, filling a duffel bag with clothes and whatever else I could grab in those few minutes. I looked around my room, the walls that had once felt safe, filled with memories of a family that had once been whole. But now, it all felt like a lie, a cruel illusion that had been shattered beyond repair. As I left, I caught one last glimpse of her and Mark standing together in the doorway, watching me with expressions I couldn't quite decipher. I turned away, walking down the driveway, knowing that there was no turning back. My mother had made it clear. I was no longer welcome, no longer part of her new life. With only $1,000 to my name and no place to go, I did the only thing I could think of. I called my grandparents. George and Helen had always been a steady presence in my life, offering love and support in ways my parents often hadn't. When I told them what had happened, there was a brief silence on the line before Grandpa George spoke, his voice thick with barely contained fury. "Come over, Ethan," he said. "You're always welcome here. We'll figure this out together." Their home was a modest, cozy place on the outskirts of town, filled with the warmth and love that I'd been missing. They greeted me at the door with open arms, pulling me into a tight hug that I hadn't realized I needed until that moment. I felt the weight of the past days finally hit me, the shock and betrayal crashing over me like a wave. My grandmother, Helen, ushered me inside, guiding me to the living room where they listened as I recounted everything that had happened. I could see the anger simmering in Grandpa's eyes, the way his jaw clenched as I spoke. Grandma was quieter, but her hands shook as she held mine, a silent testament to her own distress. How could she do that? Grandpa finally said, his voice low and filled with anger. "After everything your father went through, after everything you did for him, throwing you out like that? It's despicable." "I don't know," I replied, feeling the familiar ache in my chest. "I don't know what happened to her. It's like she became a different person after Dad died." Grandma shook her head, her eyes filled with sadness. "She's made her choice, Ethan. And if that's how she wants to live, then so be it. But you're not alone. You've got us, and we'll help you get through this." We spent the next few hours talking, going over my options, trying to make sense of the mess my life had become. Grandpa offered to help me find a place to stay, even suggesting that I could live with them for as long as I needed. It was a relief, a lifeline that I hadn't expected but desperately needed. That night, as I lay in the spare bedroom, I felt a mixture of anger and grief swirling inside me. I thought of my father, of the promises he'd made to me, of the family we were supposed to be. I thought of my mother, the woman who had once been my world, who had now cast me aside without a second thought. And I thought of Mark, the man who had somehow wormed his way into her life, into my life, with no regard for the destruction he'd left in his wake. I knew I couldn't change what had happened, couldn't force my mother to care or undo the choices she'd made. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I made a promise to myself. I would get through this. I would rebuild, find my own path, and prove that I didn't need her or anyone else to define my worth. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. I spent hours talking with Grandpa, going over job listings, considering my options. He offered to help me with money, but I refused. I wanted to do this on my own, to prove that I could stand on my own 2 feet. With his guidance, I found a part-time job at a local bookstore, a small step toward independence that felt both daunting and empowering. But even as I began to rebuild, I couldn't escape the bitterness, the sense of betrayal that gnawed at me. I thought about my mother, about the life she was building with Mark, and I couldn't help but wonder how she could move on so easily, how she could erase my father's memory and mine, without a second thought. It wasn't long before I heard the news. She was getting married. The wedding was set for the following month, a lavish affair that would no doubt be a spectacle of wealth and status. She didn't invite me. I learned about it from an old friend who'd heard it through the grapevine. She hadn't even thought to tell me herself, as if I were already forgotten, erased from her new life. I spent that night in a fog, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me like a physical force. I thought about calling her, about demanding an explanation, about confronting her with all the anger and hurt that had been building up inside me. But in the end, I didn't. I knew it wouldn't change anything, knew that she'd made her choice, and that nothing I said could alter the path she'd taken. Instead, I threw myself into work, into building a life that was mine and mine alone. I leaned on my grandparents, their unwavering support a constant reminder that I wasn't as alone as I sometimes felt. They helped me find an apartment, a small place that wasn't much but was enough for me to start over. I began saving every penny I earned, determined to build a future that I could be proud of, a future that didn't rely on anyone else's approval or validation. The day I found out about the inheritance felt like a whirlwind, like a sudden gust of wind that changes everything in an instant. Grandpa George and Grandma Helen sat me down after breakfast, their expressions serious, as if they were about to deliver news that could reshape my entire world. I could tell by the way they looked at each other, the silent exchange of glances, that this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. "Ethan," Grandpa began, his tone measured, "there's something we need to tell you. It's about your father's estate. I'd assumed Dad hadn't left much behind. He'd been ill for a long time, and we'd never been the kind of family to discuss money. I figured any savings he had were likely drained by medical bills. So, when Grandpa told me that my father had left behind $500,000, I almost laughed, thinking it had to be some kind of mistake. $500,000? I repeated, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. Why didn't anyone tell me about this before? Grandma reached over, resting a hand on mine. "Because your mother didn't want you to know," she said softly. "We only found out recently ourselves. We'd asked her about it after the funeral, and she insisted there wasn't anything left. But we did some digging, and we found the accounts." I felt a surge of anger, hot and swift, rising up like a wave. Of course, Laura had kept it hidden. She'd thrown me out, kept me in the dark, and now it turned out that she'd hidden my father's legacy from me. The money he'd left behind was supposed to be mine, my link to him, the support he'd intended for me to have. "She's been hiding it from me," I said, the reality sinking in. "She's kept this from me while she was off starting a new life with Mark." Grandpa nodded, his expression grim. "That's why we're telling you now. We want to help you fight for what's rightfully yours. Your father left that money for you, and she had no right to keep it hidden." My grandparents had always been well-connected, with a reputation in the community that went back generations. If anyone could help me navigate this, it was them. Grandpa didn't waste any time. He had connections to some of the best lawyers in town, and within days, we'd arranged a meeting with Mr. Collins, an old friend of his and one of the sharpest legal minds around. Mr. Collins was a no-nonsense type of man, with a calm and focused demeanor that inspired confidence. He listened intently as we laid out the situation, taking notes, occasionally asking for details to clarify points that might have seemed unclear. "So, let me get this straight," he said, leaning back in his chair, his gaze fixed on me. "Your father left you an inheritance of $500,000, and Laura has been withholding this from you?" I nodded, clenching my fists as the anger bubbled up again. "Yes. She never told me about it. I only found out because my grandparents uncovered the accounts." Mr. Collins raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed with Laura's actions. "I've seen cases like this before," he said. "If she's been actively hiding your inheritance, we have grounds to contest her control over the estate. We'll need to dig into the details, of course, but I'm confident we can get to the bottom of this." As we talked, I mentioned Mark, the man who had walked into our lives like a wrecking ball, shattering what was left of our family. Mr. Collins seemed to perk up at this, his expression sharpening as he jotted down a few notes. "Tell me more about Mark," he said, his gaze intense. "Do you know anything about his background?" "Not much," I admitted, "but something about him always felt off. He seemed too smooth, too calculated. I never trusted him." Mr. Collins leaned forward, his pen poised over his notepad. "I'll do some digging. If Mark has any skeletons in his closet, we'll find them. People like him usually leave a trail." A few days later, Mr. Collins called us back to his office. He'd been busy, and the files in front of him suggested that he'd uncovered more than I'd expected. He wasted no time, diving straight into the information he'd found. "Mark has a history," he began, his tone matter of fact. "A history that's less than savory. He was involved in a fraudulent investment scheme a few years back. Several people lost their savings, but he managed to avoid prison time by paying a hefty fine. From what I can tell, he's been drifting from one scheme to another, likely looking for easy marks." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I'd suspected he was trouble, but this confirmed it. He was a fraud, a con man who had likely seen an opportunity with my mother and seized it without a second thought. "Does Laura know about this?" I asked, my mind racing as I considered the implications. Mr. Collins shook his head. "It's hard to say, but given his history, I doubt he was upfront about it. These kinds of people know how to cover their tracks, to present themselves as something they're not. It wouldn't surprise me if she has no idea what he's really like." Grandpa clenched his fists, his expression steely. "We have to do something. We can't let him take advantage of Ethan or of Laura, for that matter." Mr. Collins nodded. We have options. With this information, we can challenge her control over the estate. If she knowingly concealed Ethan's inheritance and is associating with someone of Mark's reputation, it strengthens our case. But we'll need to proceed carefully. Mark is likely to retaliate if he feels threatened, and people like him don't give up easily. We spent the next several hours mapping out a plan, discussing the steps we'd need to take to expose Mark's past and reclaim my inheritance. Mr. Collins would begin by filing a petition to contest Laura's control over the estate, citing her concealment of my inheritance and her association with a known fraudster. He'd also initiate a background check on Mark, gathering as much evidence as possible to bolster our case. As we left the office, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was anger, yes, but also a sense of relief, of vindication. For the first time since all this had begun, I felt like I had a fighting chance, like I wasn't just a victim of circumstances beyond my control. With Grandpa, Grandma, and Mr. Collins on my side, I knew I could face whatever came next. The following week was a blur of meetings and paperwork. Mr. Collins worked tirelessly, gathering documents, compiling evidence, and preparing our case. He showed us records of Mark's past, evidence of the fraudulent schemes he'd been involved in, the lawsuits that had been filed against him. It was a sordid history, one that painted a clear picture of a man who thrived on deception and manipulation. But as we prepared, I couldn't help but worry. Mark wasn't the type to back down easily, and if he felt cornered, there was no telling what he might do. I didn't trust him, and the thought of him being a part of my mother's life, of potentially having control over my father's legacy, filled me with dread. One afternoon, as I was going over the latest documents with Grandpa, I received a message from Laura. It was brief, a single line that sent a chill down my spine. Asterisk, we need to talk. Come to the house tomorrow, asterisk. I showed it to Grandpa, who read it with a frown. She must know that we're contesting the estate, he said. She's probably trying to get ahead of this, to see if she can talk you out of it. I nodded, my mind racing with possibilities. I'll go, I said, feeling a surge of determination. But I'm not going to let her intimidate me. She's the one who's been lying, not me. The next day, I made my way back to the house, the place that had once been my home but now felt like enemy territory. As I approached the front door, I steeled myself, preparing for whatever awaited me inside. Laura was waiting in the living room, and Mark was nowhere to be seen. She looked different, older somehow, her face drawn and weary, but there was still a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Ethan, she began, her tone clipped and formal. I know what you're trying to do, and I'm telling you now to stop. Mark and I have plans, and you're not going to ruin them. I stared at her, disbelief and anger mixing into a potent cocktail of emotions. Plans? You mean like hiding my inheritance? Like lying to me about everything? I know about Mark, Mom. I know what kind of man he is. He's a fraud, and he's using you. How can you not see that? She flinched, but her expression remained defiant. Mark loves me, Ethan. He's been there for me when you haven't. You're just bitter because things didn't go the way you wanted. But this is my life, and you have no right to interfere. Dad left that money for me, I said, my voice low and steady. It was his legacy, and you've been hiding it from me. You have no right to take that away from me, and I won't let you. She looked away, her facade cracking just a bit. For a moment, I thought I saw a flash of regret, of something human beneath the mask. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a cold, empty look. You don't understand, Ethan, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. You never did. But you're right about one thing. I can't stop you from pursuing this. Do what you have to do, but don't expect any sympathy from me. With that, she turned away, leaving me standing there, a mix of anger and sadness welling up inside me. I knew there was no going back, no repairing the damage that had been done. But I also knew that I couldn't let her, or Mark, destroy what my father had left for me. I had a responsibility to protect his legacy, to honor the man who had been everything to me. As I left the house, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a steely resolve that pushed aside the doubts and fears. With Grandpa, Grandma, and Mr. Collins on my side, I knew I could face whatever came next. Mark might be a fraud, a con man who thought he could manipulate his way into our lives, but he'd underestimated us. And as long as I had breath in my body, I would fight to make sure he never got his hands on what didn't belong to him. This wasn't just about the money. It was about respect, about family, about standing up for what was right. And no matter how long it took, I was ready for the battle ahead. I didn't waste any time. Armed with Mr. Collins' findings, I called Laura to arrange a meeting. She agreed, probably thinking it was a chance for her to talk me out of pursuing the inheritance any further. She had no idea what I was about to bring to light. The very next morning, I arrived at the house and found Laura waiting in the living room, her expression tense but expectant. I wasted no time getting straight to the point. "Mom, I know about the inheritance," I began, my voice steady. "I know Dad left $500,000, and I know you've been hiding it from me." She blinked, taken aback, but quickly recovered, smoothing her expression into one of practiced neutrality. "I don't know where you're getting this from, Ethan, but there is no hidden inheritance. I don't have any money of your father's. He left us with nothing." I pulled out the documents Mr. Collins had given me, dropping them onto the coffee table between us. "I have proof," I said, watching as her eyes scanned the papers. "Bank statements, the account numbers. I know it's all there. And I also know about Mark's criminal history, the fraud, the scams. Did you know about that? Or did he keep you in the dark too?" Her face flushed, her composure beginning to crack. This is ridiculous," she stammered. "Mark explained everything to me. Those charges were all misunderstandings. He's a good man, and he's been good to me." I could hear the desperation in her voice, the edge of defensiveness as she scrambled for excuses. "You can't seriously believe that. He's using you, Mom. He has a history of doing this to people. You think he really loves you? He's here for the money, and he doesn't care what happens to you once he gets what he wants." Before she could respond, Mark entered the room, his gaze shifting between us as he took in the scene. He'd clearly overheard enough to know what was going on. He walked over to Laura, placing a protective arm around her shoulder, as if his mere presence would be enough to shield her from the truth. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. "You seem awfully worked up, Ethan. Maybe you're just misunderstanding the situation." "Not at all," I replied, keeping my voice firm. "I'm here to get what's rightfully mine, and I'm not leaving until we settle this. I know about your past, Mark. I know about the fraud, the scams. You're not going to pull the wool over my eyes." He let out a low, humorless chuckle. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But I'm not sure you know what you're dealing with here. How about this?" He reached into his pocket, pulling out an envelope and tossing it onto the table. $50,000. Take it, and you walk away. You keep quiet, and we'll all move on like none of this ever happened." I glanced at the envelope, feeling a surge of disgust. "You think you can just buy me off?" I shot back. "This isn't about the money. This is about what's right. You don't belong here, and I'm not going to let you ruin what's left of our family." His eyes narrowed, and I could see the shift in his expression, a cold, calculating look that sent a chill down my spine. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You'd better think carefully about what you're doing, Ethan. I don't take kindly to threats, and I won't let you or anyone else ruin what I've built here. Take the money, or there will be consequences." I held my ground, refusing to be intimidated. "You don't scare me, Mark. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not taking your bribe. I've got everything I need to expose you, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." He straightened up, his face twisted with barely concealed rage. "Fine, have it your way. But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he stormed out of the room, leaving Laura standing there, looking stunned and defeated. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of relief and tension. The confrontation was over, but I knew this was only the beginning. I needed to take things further, to bring everything out into the open. The next day, I gathered the family and a few close friends at my grandparents' house, calling a meeting that I knew would shake up everything. Grandpa and Grandma had been more than supportive. They'd reached out to family members, subtly hinting that there were things that needed to be discussed, truths that had to be brought to light. By the time everyone arrived, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation and unease. As the room filled with familiar faces, I could see the curiosity in their eyes, the way they glanced at each other, silently wondering what this was all about. I stood at the front, waiting until the murmurs had quieted before beginning. "Thank you all for coming," I started, looking around the room, meeting each person's gaze. "I know you're probably wondering why I've called you here. There are things about my father's estate, about what's been happening since his passing, that you deserve to know. This is about our family, our legacy, and I can't keep it to myself any longer." Laura and Mark sat together near the back, their faces tense. Mark looked ready to bolt at any moment, while Laura seemed torn between anger and fear. I took a deep breath and laid everything out, recounting the events that had led up to this moment. The discovery of the hidden inheritance, the confrontation with Laura, the bribe Mark had offered, and, finally, the evidence of Mark's criminal past. "I didn't want to believe it at first," I said, my voice steady. "But there's no denying it now. Mark has a history of fraud, of scamming people out of their money. And he's been hiding this from all of you, hoping to get his hands on the estate my father left behind." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs, family members exchanging shocked glances, some of them looking at Laura with expressions of hurt and betrayal. I could see the impact of my words hitting home, the realization dawning on their faces that they'd been lied to, manipulated by the very people they trusted. Mark stood up, attempting to put on a show of indignation. "This is all nonsense," he shouted, his voice laced with desperation. "Ethan is making baseless accusations. He's trying to stir up trouble because he didn't get his way. You all know me. I'm an honest man. This is just a smear campaign." I turned to Mr. Collins, who was seated nearby, and he stepped forward, holding up a stack of documents. "Actually, Mark," he said calmly, "we have more than enough evidence to back up Ethan's claims. These are records from your previous fraud cases, copies of court documents, testimonies from victims. The truth is right here, in black and white." Mark's face went pale, and I could see the fear creeping into his eyes as he realized that his lies had finally caught up with him. He glanced around the room, as if searching for someone who might come to his defense, but no one moved. They were all watching him with a mixture of anger and disappointment, their trust shattered by the revelations that had just been laid bare. Laura looked down, her face flushed with humiliation. I could tell she was struggling to process everything, the reality of the situation sinking in as the weight of her decisions came crashing down around her. She didn't try to defend him, didn't say a word as the silence in the room grew heavier. "This is your doing, isn't it?" Mark hissed at her, his voice low and venomous. "You never could keep your mouth shut. This is all falling apart because of you." Laura looked up, her eyes glistening with tears, but she said nothing. For once, it seemed she had no fight left in her, no more defenses to hide behind. She had thrown her lot in with a con man, and now she was facing the consequences. The rest of the family began to speak up, their voices a chorus of disbelief and anger. Aunt Susan, who had always been close to my mother, shook her head, tears streaming down her face as she turned to Laura. "How could you do this, Laura?" she asked, her voice trembling. "After everything Robert did for you, after all the years we've known each other, how could you let this man come between us?" Laura looked away, unable to meet her gaze. I felt a pang of pity for her. Despite everything, she had made her choice, and now she was paying the price. But there was no going back, no undoing the damage that had been done. Mark, realizing that his chances of saving face were slipping away, turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing through the hall. No one moved to stop him. The door slammed shut behind him, and I felt a surge of relief, a sense of victory that I hadn't anticipated. He was gone, his influence over our family shattered in an instant. Laura sat there, alone and defeated, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her as the family looked on. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow as I watched her, knowing that this was the end of an era, the end of the family I had once known. After the public humiliation and the exposure of his fraud, he'd had enough. He packed up what little he could and left town, abandoning Laura to deal with the aftermath. His retreat was sudden, but not surprising. Men like him thrived on deceit and vanished just as quickly when their lies unraveled. He was gone without a trace, leaving Laura behind to face the reality of her decisions. Once Mark was out of the picture, things moved quickly. With the community now fully aware of the deceit and betrayal, the support for me and my grandparents was overwhelming. People reached out, offering assistance, sharing words of encouragement, and making it clear that they stood with us. The town had turned against Laura, their sympathy for her replaced by anger and disappointment. With Mr. Collins leading the charge, we took legal action to reclaim the house and the inheritance my father had left for me. The case was strong, bolstered by the evidence we had gathered of Mark's fraudulent activities and Laura's attempt to conceal my inheritance. Laura put up a fight initially, but it was clear that she didn't have much ground to stand on. She was now isolated, without Mark's influence or support, and her claims fell apart under scrutiny. The court proceedings, though drawn out, ultimately worked in our favor. Mr. Collins presented the case with precision, laying out every detail of Mark's involvement, the fraud, the lies, and Laura's complicity. He argued that her attempt to hide the inheritance had been an act of bad faith, one that denied me my rightful place in the estate and dishonored my father's wishes. As the judge reviewed the evidence, I could see the weight of the situation beginning to press down on Laura. She sat there, her face pale, her shoulders slumped, no longer the confident woman who had once tried to cast me out. She was stripped bare, forced to confront the reality of her actions. I felt no satisfaction watching her in that state, only a cold certainty that this was the consequence of her choices. Finally, the ruling came. The judge granted us full control over the estate, awarding the house and the inheritance back to me. It was a victory, one that my grandparents and I had fought hard for, and as we walked out of the courthouse, the relief was palpable. I felt a burden lift from my shoulders, a sense of justice served. The house, my father's legacy, was back in the family where it belonged. Returning to the house was bittersweet. The place had been tainted by the memories of betrayal, but it was also filled with remnants of my father, traces of the life he had built for us. I knew I couldn't leave it in its current state. It needed to be restored, to be given new life, and I was determined to make it a place that honored his memory. Using part of the inheritance, I began planning the renovations. I enlisted the help of local craftsmen, people my father had known, people who understood the significance of the house and what it meant to me. We stripped the walls, tore up the floors, and rebuilt it piece by piece. The work was painstaking, but each change, each improvement, felt like a step toward reclaiming what had been lost. During the renovation, I found old family photos, tucked away in forgotten corners, images of my father smiling, laughing, living a life that seemed so distant now. I kept them, determined to restore them, to bring back the warmth and love that had once filled the home. With every nail driven, every wall painted, I felt a sense of renewal, a connection to the past that gave me strength. While the renovations were underway, Laura tried to reach out. She came by the house one day, looking uncertain, her usual bravado replaced with something that resembled vulnerability. I saw her through the window before she knocked, taking a deep breath before she stepped onto the porch. When I opened the door, I could see the hesitation in her eyes, a flicker of regret that seemed almost genuine. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft, almost pleading. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you. I just want a chance to explain." I stood there, listening, letting her words wash over me. She talked about how lost she'd felt after Dad died, how she'd clung to Mark as a way to escape the pain. She admitted that she had been wrong, that she had let herself be blinded by desperation, by a need for something she couldn't quite name. But as she spoke, I felt no sympathy, no pull to forgive her. The hurt she'd caused was too deep, the betrayal too raw. She had chosen Mark over me, had chosen to erase the family we once had, and there was no going back from that. "I can't do this, Mom," I said, my voice steady. "You made your choice and I've made mine. This house, this inheritance, it's all I have left of Dad, and I'm not going to let you take that from me. I'm moving forward, with or without you." Her face fell, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but I didn't waver. She nodded, taking a shaky breath before turning and walking away. I watched her go, feeling a strange sense of closure. She was out of my life now, and I was ready to leave that chapter behind. On the final day of the renovation, I stood in the front yard, looking at the house, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Grandpa and Grandma joined me, their expressions filled with pride and love. They had been my rock through all of this, their support unwavering, their belief in me a constant source of strength. "We did it," Grandpa said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Your father would be proud, Ethan. You've done right by him." If you like the story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.